You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 25, Duty, Honor, and Trouble. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Norman Lau. Each week on Gene-ology, we do our duty to revisit Gene Roddenberry's earliest TV writing, checking along the way for the kind of morals, meanings, and messages that he went to such trouble to put in his most famous creation, Star Trek.
This week, one last visit to the 1950s CBS series West Point, where one cadet swears an oath to duty, honor, and trouble.
Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here's how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, leave us a review and a rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now here's Earl Green with this week's Duty, Honor, and Trivia.
Thank you, Norman. Here we are at the last of Gene's West Point scripts. Or is it among the earliest of them? We recently had an interesting conversation on the Mission Log Discord with a listener who was so intrigued by our coverage of West Point, they decided to track down the DVD set for themselves, which took a couple of attempts on eBay, that kind of makes me worry, Norm, that maybe we are accidentally driving up the value of West Point on DVD on the secondary market. But when they got the set, the titles of the episodes did not match up with what's on IMDb, and neither did the order that the episodes were in on DVD, and yet some online sources claim that this episode is one of the last episodes to air, but what I found looking at the end credits was that the copyright date was 1956. So, maybe one of the earliest? Maybe one of the latest? Welcome to the weird vacuum of information that we are dealing with ourselves in piecing together the history of Gene's TV writing career. Speaking of the vacuum of information, let's meet the cast. Paul Stickles stars as Cadet Don Carter, though according to IMDb, this is his only screen acting credit. It's just possible that IMDb is wrong, however. Keep in mind, it is crowdsourced. And Paul could have other appearances of the same vintage that simply have not been entered into IMDb. I did find a couple of references to Paul directing regional theater in New Jersey and Arizona, but even those mentions were fairly vague. By comparison, there's a lot more information on the actors who played Don's parents. Dorothy Adams has film credits stretching back to the 1930s, though many of them went uncredited. She became a fixture of the small screen in the 50s, appearing in Death Valley Days, I Led 3 Lives, Pepsi Cola Playhouse, which, by the way, that is a new one on me. I'd never heard of that before. Dragnet, General Electric Theater, The Twilight Zone, Wagon Train, and Bonanza, among any others. Probably her most prominent credit is a number of non-speaking roles in the Ten Commandments. Playing Don's dad was Howard Wright, whose career was much more focused on television. He appeared in guest roles in Mr. District Attorney, Science Fiction Theater, Highway Patrol, Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, The Untouchables, and again, The Twilight Zone. Howard also wrote episodes of The Gene Autry Show, and songs written by him appeared on everything from The Muppet Show to the radio show A Prairie Home Companion. But the most familiar face might be Arch Johnson as the captain who tries to advise Cadet Carter. He was all over guest-starring TV roles from the 50s through the early 80s, racking up no fewer than 3 Twilight Zone roles: The Munsters, The Donna Reed Show, Perry Mason, The Monkees, The Invaders, Bewitched, Love American Style, Shaft the Series, The Bionic Woman, and Wonder Woman, among many others. And we will see Arch again in an episode of The Lieutenant.
You guys don't have to be polite. Now you know why I never talked about my family.
Hey, your folks here at the point?
I'm surprised you didn't hear him. Everyone else did.
Lucky guy.
As long as we're already planned tonight, the three of you come. Our folks can get acquainted.
Sorry.
Oh, come on. My dad yells at a ball game, too.
Your folks fit. They belong.
These are your own people, your own flesh and blood.
3 years here changes a person. I can't live the way I used to.
Look, Don, you're a big man around here. You're set for cadet command next year. Why push the panic button?
I thought they understood. They've got their life. I want mine.
Maybe this sounds corny, but isn't there something wrong with hurting people that care for you?
I don't want to hurt them. Look, I had to fight to get here. Maybe harder than you did. I was third alternate 3 years running. And when I finally got here, I had to change every habit, every value, my whole way of thinking.
Act 1. Play ball! Cadet Don Carter is playing in today's varsity baseball game, and his parents, paying a visit to West Point, are sitting in the stands. Only it's a surprise visit, and he doesn't know that they're there. Until Don's up at bat, and his dad starts shouting from the stands. Now he knows his parents are there. Distracted, Don strikes out. Army still wins the game, but in the locker room, Don is clearly not happy his folks are at the point. He's been away from home for 3 years. He's not the boy who left home. Don's teammates are stunned by his reaction. These are your own family, your flesh and blood. Aren't you at least a little excited to see them? Don's answer is pretty much a big nope. He had to fight just to graduate high school, let alone win his placement at West Point. He had to change his whole way of thinking to do it. Don almost feels like his family was a liability. That afternoon, Don meets up with his parents and discovers they'll be staying the whole weekend, a trip he is surprised that they could afford. Waiting to order dinner at the Thayer Hotel, Don has to ask his mom to forego some of her habits from home, such as wiping down the already clean silverware. The next day, he has to point out that his parents are sitting someplace that isn't really approved for sitting. Worse yet, his dad's just taking off his shoes in public to rub his feet. As Don continues giving his parents the standard West Point tour, they bump into Captain Davis, Don's TAC officer. The captain offers to join the Carters as their tour takes them toward the West Point Museum. Something tells me Don's dad has all the schematics and diagrams back home. But the tour of the grounds leaves the Carters, frankly, kind of exhausted, and that includes Don. It's not that he's not up to walking the whole campus, but having to deal with his parents has left him on edge. When a couple of Don's bunkmates show up and introduce themselves, Don snaps at, well, everybody. Finally, Don's dad comes clean. They're not exactly enjoying their visit. So much walking and so little of the son who left home. Don's a completely different person, especially now that he's gone off on everyone. The Carters decide to shorten their stay and go home. Act 2. The Carters have gone home. Don's more at ease, but still troubled by their visit. But with his fellow cadets having gotten a taste of how Don was treating his folks, he's getting the cold shoulder on campus and especially in the barracks, and not just with his fellow cadets. Captain Davis asks Don point blank what's wrong between him and his family. After trying to push the question off with a formal cadet-to-officer answer, Don opens up a little bit more. He's simply not as proud of his parents as they are of him. Captain Carter gives Don quite a lecture. West Point is here to turn out leaders who can take troops from wildly different backgrounds and turn them into an effective force. If Don Carter expects to be a leader, that'll mean accepting people who are perhaps not up to his standard. And maybe Don should start by accepting his own family. Dismissed. And that night, never mind the TAC, Don's still taking heat from his fellow cadets over how he treated his parents. He discovers that one of his buddies came from a farming background. He and his two brothers all worked the family farm. One's a doctor, one's a lawyer, and he's a West Point cadet. Not too shabby for a bunch of farm boys. With his behavior weighing on him, Don gets permission to fly home to visit his folks, but when he gets there, his mother informs him that Mr. Carter has not been feeling well, and they didn't tell Don this because they didn't want him to worry and be distracted from his studies and training. It's clear that Mrs. Carter is running interference for her husband, and it's clear that the real affliction is that Don's parents are both deeply hurt by his behavior. Sometime later, Don has been promoted to Cadet Command and leads his company on the parade grounds, and once again the Cruthers are watching proudly. Somehow, Mr. Cruther's health returned. Probably because Don has had a change of heart and has decided that he is as proud of his parents as they are of him. The end.
Duty, honor, and let's get into some trouble. What do you say, Earl? Fantastic recap. We have mentioned before, I think we did this on a previous episode, mentioning that the tightness of the script really does help us lean into making these recaps, because I think Gene's formulation is starting to get so fine and, I should say, refined and well-tuned, that it just feels so snappy, especially in these last few episodes, this being the last one that we're covering. How did you feel about writing this recap after watching the episode? Did you feel like it leans into a recap format easily?
Well, the story is already so condensed. You have 20-odd minutes to do this in, and some of these I have clocked at like 24 minutes, some of them at 26 minutes. Either way, for comparison, let's talk for purposes of comparison. You're talking about maybe a couple of minutes more than the airtime of an episode of Star Trek Prodigy.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what those episodes are like.
Yep.
There is no time for filler. It's it's got to be all killer, no filler.
That's right.
Now, one thing I did notice, and I think we're both going to have some comments on the location photography here. At the beginning of the episode, at the baseball game, when Don steps out of the dugout, picks up those two bats, and he's heading toward home plate. Is there something on fire behind him? Because there was a lot of smoke in the air. Now, I know this is produced by Ziv, and these are the same people who infamously let it slide when a llama wandered into the background of a shot with Broderick Crawford while Highway Patrol was doing location shooting near a petting zoo. And yeah, just leave the llama in. That's okay. That's perfectly normal. But, man, there's stuff on fire back there. I couldn't tell if this was from a chimney or what, because there was so much smoke. Like an alarming amount of smoke.
Not possible for it to be like a couple of guys hanging out having a cigar?
No, definitely a lot more smoke than that.
I'll have to take a look at that again, yeah, because production, you got to keep moving forward.
Yeah, and, like we've said in the past, Fred Ziv has given you 30 hours to shoot an episode. That's it.
That's right. Talking about Don's parents, because we get to see them at the opening in the baseball game, kind of shuffling through the bleachers in the crowd. Is it me, or did they look slightly older for parents than someone who would be in their early 20s? And I'm wondering if they chose to go this direction to make there be more of a distance between them physically as opposed to emotionally, or both.
That's possible. Now, I can kind of relate to that because I was born when my dad was in his 50s. It's a thing that happens. And so from the standpoint of my own experience, the father being much older than the son, normal part of my upbringing, and so it didn't really register with me that he seemed that much older. I really think that the actor, what was his name, Howard Wright? I think he did a good job of just kind of... There's something universal and timeless about embarrassing dad at a sports event.
Totally.
Yeah, come on, champ, get him!
Yeah.
And it's like, and you're just sitting there like, oh, Dad, no.
Yeah, yep. As you were saying about being economical and streamlining narrative for time, one of the things I thought was really interesting when Don was talking to his friends about how much he had to fight to get into West Point, he said something along the lines of, look, he turns his fingers over to show him his fingernail beds. And he says, clean fingernails, that isn't much to you, is it? I even had to learn that. I love how visually impactful that is, because somewhere along the lines, he, like his folks, all came from farmers, or people working the land, or really, really heavy blue-collar work, labor. So I like that. It's something that it just adds to kind of like your overall, like your mind's eye picture of who he was before who he is.
Yeah, it's very good shorthand. Again, various points in my life, I've done stuff like working on horse farms. I can totally relate to clean fingernails seeming like almost a luxury in that scenario.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I usually don't timestamp things in these episodes because I know it's difficult for our audience to watch some of these, but for posterity, in case you actually do get a chance to watch this, at 3 minutes 34 seconds in, I love the sheer cringe that Don has on his face when he's actually hearing for the first time his parents in the bleachers, who he didn't know was coming, yelling at him, recognizing the voice, and then kind of emotionally falling apart at the plate. It was a really nice bit of acting.
The funny thing, okay, you're talking about timestamp in terms of where it happens in the episode.
Exactly.
In terms of timestamping it historically, though, again, this is that universal thing. This has not changed.
True.
If anything, I think maybe it's gotten worse because, we have had... I don't know how long it's been an issue now, 10 or 20 years that we've been talking about the issue of helicopter parents trying to manage a sporting event their kids are in from the stands.
Mm-hmm.
To the point that someone needs to go over and say, okay, would you hush up and let him play? He's a kid.
Yeah, I don't know when that dynamic changed, but yeah, somewhere within the last 20 years. Maybe a little bit earlier, but yeah, I've heard situations about that, and having nieces and nephews myself, and having experienced watching parents and relatives behave in a certain way from the bleachers, it's a little concerning, off-putting sometimes, sure. There's a scene, though, when the baseball game kind of, is over and Don sees his parents for the first time, and, he basically... he throws his hand out like a jab just to make sure his dad stays at distance. And then his mom tries to approach him, and he grabs both of her hands by the wrists and kind of forces them down like, don't touch me, maintain a decorum and distance. This is how things are. And I was like, oh, this is during Parents' Weekend, man. And all of these little scenes, they set a very specific tone at the very beginning of this episode.
Yeah, there's so much of this, and I spotted some other things kind of along these lines. I don't know if you noticed this. When Don and his parents go to dinner, for all of his talk about, I'm a new man, I'm a different man, I'm a better man. Maybe this is me being super old-fashioned, because, again, keep in mind, raised by one parent significantly older than the other, I kind of picked up multiple sets of values here. I was stunned that he brought up the rear and did not get up there and hold the door open for his parents to enter the dining hall at the hotel. Yeah, at least for his mom. Now, I noticed a moment later, he does at least help seat her at the table. Come on, Don. So I also wondered, is this visual shorthand for he thinks he's better than them?
Well, I think, yeah, we're going to get to that in a second, because there's the whole, I walked through the door first. You can follow me if you want, but since I didn't invite you, doesn't really matter. There was an exchange earlier on in the locker room with some of his friends where he says, I don't mean to harm these people. I have nothing against them. I just don't have anything in common with them, right? So, but I don't agree with that statement, because it's not that he doesn't, it's that he chooses not to. Those are two completely different things. One's a mindset and one's a happenstance. I mean, there's also an example of when he's embarrassed about his mom kind of like, doing the whole breathing on the silverware to polish off, like, dishwater spots. That's something she would do at home. It's reflex. It's something he probably would have done at home. And just like his fingernails, he's learned differently being at the point. And then he moves his dad's hat off the table. You can just feel with every single act and breath that this guy is unbelievably put off and embarrassed by those people being there. Those people being his parents.
I thought I noticed the thing with the hat, and I actually backed up and watched again. It's like, did I see what I think I just saw? Because we have seen in West Point episodes past, in the mess hall, when they are all in mess dress, they take their caps off, and there is a crossbar under their chair where they place their caps.
Yeah.
It might be kind of a military reflex that's been drilled into him, And I don't know if this business was all worked out among the actors or with the director, but it was all really well done. There were a few times where I felt like the actor playing Don was working almost too hard to telegraph his expression to the camera, how uncomfortable he is, and yet there are other times it was very subtle. You know, like with the hat, just like, let's, do this and not say anything about it. So some of it I chalk up to the acting style of the time. Somewhere between the actors and the director, a lot of business was worked out that I wonder if it was in the script. Because again, with West Point, we don't have Gene's scripts, but we do have the finished shows. I would love to see what the script had to say about that, if that was in the script or if that was just worked out on the day, on the stage.
Well, one thing that I think we've brought this up from time to time, but a lot of the actors, who appeared in series in the 1950s, they would have been not screen actors, stage actors before they became screen actors. So there may have been a gear shift in terms of how they were trained, and it didn't translate quickly enough, for the small screen because, as we know with stage actors, you have to act, over exaggeratedly in a way so that you can make sure that the front row and the back row are all seeing the same performance. But TV captures the nuance, much more with much more fidelity and much more, intimacy than what's needed in terms of that overacting style. But not every actor, can, has the ability to switch that off, and especially in like the medium of TV, which was just kind of new at the time. So I do at times watch these episodes and I'm like, well, a little much, but at the time that was probably less than an overblown stage actor performance. So
yeah, and I think we did establish in trivia that the actor playing Don Carter, the cadet, is from more of a stage background and had more of a stage career than he did in front of a TV camera.
I love the timing of when the TAC officer comes into frame, into the story, because it's just around the same time that Don is a little bit at his wit's end, with his parents, and all of a sudden here's the TAC officer to pretty much be inserted as our moral compass as we're watching the show, because at this time Don can go one of two really, extreme directions. Either he gives up and accepts his parents, or he goes completely the other opposite direction, which is what he did, and finds a way to get rid of him. And the TAC officer's just like, this is something I should pay attention to. And I really love it when it happens in the series. You're like, okay, there it is. There's the TAC officer. That's what's happening right now.
It's a different TAC officer every time, but he's basically playing the same role. It's like, hello, kids, TAC officer Jiminy Cricket here.
That's right. Yep. No more so than, we saw Don's extreme frustration when his dad takes off his shoes at the end of the tour, can't go on, and starts rubbing his feet. But it's like he starts rubbing his feet, then his friends show up to greet the parents, and then his dad doesn't even put his shoes back on, and the sweat off of his feet is probably still on his fingertips, and Don must be just out of his mind by this time.
Yeah, that seemed to be the last straw for him. It's just because it's right after that he just snaps and goes off on everyone in the shot.
Mm-hmm. We were talking about this establishing shot in Act 2 where the camera is so far pulled back that you just see the entirety of the dormitory and the smallest cadet walking across, in scale, obviously, walking across kind of the sidewalk, to the dormitory. And I'm wondering if this was a conscious decision by the director to make Don feel that isolated and small.
That would be assuming that this shot was purpose shot for this episode. Because I found myself wondering, because we spend a long time on this shot. And, the Central Barracks has several entrances and stairways up to those entrances. And this cadet passes the first entrance to the building, and then the second entrance, keeps walking to the third entrance, and then up the stairs and into the building. That takes a long time to happen.
Yeah.
And so I found myself wondering if we got into the edit bay with this, and we were like, oh, we're 25 seconds short of where this episode needs to be ready for air. Because you've only sold so much commercial time. So your show would have to come out to something like 25 minutes, 15 seconds on the dot. I kind of found myself wondering if maybe this was second unit film that they had cataloged, like, oh, I'm not sure we can use this because there's this one guy walking out there. And then they came to this one and it was like, oh, hey, we've got second unit film of this one guy walking out there.
Well, the neat thing is about working with West Point is some of these things can be serendipitous, by just having a camera crew on there just filming B-roll all the time.
Yeah, that's true. And this may be a case where it was either purpose shot for the episode, or they just lucked out because it did fit the story. It fit the story like a glove.
Oh, yeah.
He's gone off on his buddies. No one's out there walking with him. He is a man alone.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I do like that they have his friends at times, be the sounding boards for his bad behavior. There's a scene where Don, as soon as he walks into the dormitory, runs into Jerry, who's his roommate, and Jerry says, "Sure, mister, if you can live without a heart, that's your business." Because he's talking about how he treated his parents, and, Don has his business, and Jerry's like, well, I don't agree, but it's nice to see a little bit of pushback from his friends. And we'll see that a little bit later on, because there's another instance where Don and Jerry are studying, and then a couple other friends come by, and they talk about their backgrounds and how they were from blue-collar families. And as much as I love that scene, the reason why I bring that up, Earl, is because that same guy who's talking about how he worked the fields alongside his two brothers, and one of them became a doctor, one of them became a lawyer, and this one's now at West Point, he fires up a cigarette, and one, I was like, they're allowed to smoke in their dorms, and two, I never really got how people that have so many physical fitness requirements on a daily basis as part of their routine still have time to smoke and actually still hold up to those physical fitness requirements.
Well, the thing that struck me is I think this is the second time we've seen someone smoke in West Point. And the first time was Robert Vaughn. But, yeah, like you, I'm sitting here thinking, don't you guys need to quit this stuff? Because you've got physicals you've got to pass.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, back then those physicals were probably conducted by a doctor who was smoking like a burning building. So, a very, very different world. I mean, and it was still a very different world for at least another 10 years, because I can think of at least one episode of The Lieutenant, which was Gene's show that aired in 63 and 64, where they have scenes of people smoking in a hospital.
Oh, yeah.
And
nonstop.
Yeah, nonstop. Of course, now you and I think of a hospital in 2024, and we're thinking there are rooms with increased oxygen in them. You do not want combustion happening anywhere around that.
Right. I do like it when Don finally reconciles with his TAC officer's advice, goes home, sees his mom, and a wonderful contrast to seeing his mom the very first time when he kind of shunted her affection towards him. He goes there and he kisses his mom on the lips. Now, I know that watching it today may be a little strange, but I think it's again, with the whole nuanced storytelling and economy of style, describing Don's background, maybe this is the way he was. This is the way he can't be at West Point without any affection at all. But then when he's in the privacy of his own life, he can be that Don again for his mom.
Yeah, but you notice she's not exactly giving him the warmest of welcomes at that time. And there's something you can kind of read into that that's sort of like, oh, sure, you're going to give me a big hug and a kiss when there's no witnesses.
Yeah, right. That's a very good point. And obviously that's kind of part of what's going on here. And I do love small details like Don trying to, he has that crystallizing moment when he picks up a picture of, it's one of those twin frames where you had a left and right twin frame where you see him as a boy and him as a cadet, that their love and pride for him never stopped, even though his love and pride for them maybe has. So it's just one of those, again, economy moments where you're kind of getting a little bit tugged at here in the heartstrings.
They're also in this scene when Don is talking to his mom, and basically she's running interference for his dad. She's like, you can't go in there and talk to him. He's sick. And, she's talking about, we discussed it on the way home, and we're just going to leave things where they were. Basically like, okay, our parent and child relationship is done. And right after that, when Don is trying to make his case and excuse his own behavior, his mom says, I may be an ignorant woman, but I know the truth. So this episode had me all in on acceptance and meeting people where they are, but, we try to put ourselves in that time and not look at it from 2024. But I can't help but hear that statement from a 2024 perspective and think that any system that has conditioned Mrs. Carter to think this way of herself urgently needs to be dismantled. Because I hate that her automatic reaction is, I may be an ignorant woman. It's like, no, you're not. You raised this kid. Whoever he may be now, you made him basically good enough to be accepted into Army officer training. And, this is something I'm not sure we've fixated on a whole lot. West Point, this is not enlisted men. Right. They are training the officers at West Point. And so, no, you're not an ignorant woman. Brought this kid into the world and got him to a point, where he's accepted into the Army for officer training. He is a future leader. Take some credit. Okay, Norm, I'm pretty sure I probably tipped my hand during the recap that you can draw a direct line from duty, honor, and trouble to at least part of one of Star Trek The Next Generation's best hours, which is family. Most of family, obviously and quite rightly, is devoted to Captain Picard recovering after he's been rescued from the Borg in The Best of Both Worlds Part 2. But even that story shares airtime with two other stories, Wesley getting this posthumous holodeck letter from his late father, and Worf welcoming his adoptive parents aboard the Enterprise and acting so embarrassed about them to his crewmates, his superiors, anyone in that shot. It's the Worf plotline in this 1990 episode of Next Gen that I feel can trace its storytelling lineage straight back to this West Point episode from 56. And it's kind of sad that both Gene and Michael Piller are gone. So literally, the only person who could answer this firsthand would be Ronald D. Moore, who wrote the episode Family, and of course now he's this high-powered showrunner in his own right of such acclaimed series as For All Mankind and Outlander. And so, way above my level, I don't exactly have Ron in my speed dial, unfortunately. I would love to know if Gene, who was still at least actively consulting on Next Gen in 1990, even if he wasn't directly writing for the show anymore, had any hand in suggesting Worf's plotline. Because Worf's story in Family is duty, honor, and trouble. It's basically the same story. Of course, it involves a Klingon, so it's duty, honor, and trouble.
Yeah.
But it's also important to remember that Ron Moore came from a military background himself. I think he was in the Navy, if I remember correctly. My apologies if I'm misremembering that. So there's just as much of a chance that it came from his own experiences as well, because there is much about this story, and we have talked about this before, all the way back to, parents in the bleachers. It's just universal. It's timeless. It's a human behavior that doesn't change, and it keeps recurring.
Right, and I think that that's an interesting point to make, because it's not necessarily either true or we can trace, the origin of this particular motif, to Duty, Honor, and Trouble, written by Gene Roddenberry. So I'm just wondering if there were other famous similar stories that, may be out there, movies or, short stories where it's the whole, I'm embarrassed by my parents, I reject where I came from. I'm trying to make myself distance from my, checkered past. Then all of a sudden, I have this realization that who I am is because of who I was. Right? And when you figure that out, then you start reconciling, did I miss out on anything in the meantime, in the in-between, right?
And we have run into instances before where Gene has kind of done his own riff on something that already existed. Like he did way back in Mr. District Attorney, he kind of did his own little 30-minute version of Gaslight. And you have to keep in mind that we are in an era where old movies were not yet being constantly rerun on TV. It was starting to happen, but it was not a fixture of the schedule yet. And so you could do your own version of Gaslight. And it has not been so overexposed that everyone's going to recognize, oh, he's doing Gaslight. With this strong similarity to Family in mind, I found myself wondering who told the story better. Because I've got some big structural issues with Duty, Honor, and Trouble. Most especially, there is this gigantic narrative leap from Dad standing in the doorway at home to everything's okay, we're back at the point, we're on the parade grounds. That felt like just a little bit of a cheat. It felt like a cop-out, because whatever father-son talk happened off-screen, it seemed to me like that was what the episode needed to show us. And the first time I watched this episode, my instant reaction was just, oh, boo, Gene, that was cheap.
That's an interesting thing. I'm not sure if I saw it the same way. I can see definitely your point in this, for sure. But I think that's where the TAC officer character always comes into play. I'm trying to, actually not always reference the masculinity script of the 1950s. But the scene that you feel is needed to be in there, I think is the reason why it's not in there. And it's because there's a shorthand of fathers and sons basically foregoing that particular part of their relationship and just accepting that we're good, we move on, because it's part of the masculinity script of never show your true feelings. I'm not saying that that's correct, because obviously you and I have had very strong feelings about that particular 4-part strategy of why men in that era thought the way they did. But at least in this episode, I'm like, okay, that's just what it is expected of Gene to write, to kind of gloss over that because that's the way people were. And I'm also thinking, where would they have been able to cut out really good parts of the story to make the time for that scene?
Well, I don't know, maybe cut out that shot where all the smoke is in the background. Shorten that shot of the cadet walking up to not the first, not the second, but the third entrance. And up the stairs. And in. You could have gotten time from somewhere. But yeah, you do bring up a very good point that I hadn't really considered, which was, we're men, and men don't talk about their feelings. At least not where anyone can see.
Yes. Again, and when you have somebody like a TAC officer show up, and they're always in uniform, and they're always very present, their agency is strong in that scene, and you're paying attention to them, and there's this is like the big brother or young father that's speaking to the problem. Not even necessarily the cadet, but to you, the viewer out there. This is what you need to know. This is how you reconcile the problem.
Yeah. Well, in Captain Davis, in this episode, I don't know if you noticed, the TAC officer Jiminy Cricket, in whatever form he takes, always has to be in uniform, because if the cadet's just not getting it, you have to do what Captain Davis did in this episode and say, hey, I didn't say at ease at any point, and kind of like
in the command.
Cadet Bellman's dad. Oh, we need to have a talk. Oh, sure, Dad. This is a formal talk.
Suck that chin in.
TAC officer Jiminy Cricket still needs to be able to pull rank on these kids in case they're like, yeah, but, I'm not buying what you're saying. It's like, oh, no.
It's like you're under the impression that this is a negotiation.
Yeah, you've mistaken this for a conversation, Cadet. Going back to Family one last time, I think the reason this comparison is fascinating to me is because Family does not cop out of that conversation and the resolution. We hear how Worf squares things with Sergei and Helena. And here's the crazy thing. I started keeping a timer on Family for all of the Worf scenes. Anything that touched on the Worf storyline. From the opening teaser where Riker's, "Why are you worried about your parents coming on board?" to the very end where Picard meets Worf's parents very briefly on his way out of the transporter room. I ran a timer on all of the Worf and Rozhenko's related scenes and stopped the timer for everything else. That story got told in Next Gen in 11 minutes and 57 seconds, basically conforming to most of the same plot contours as Duty, Honor, and Trouble, down to people like Riker and Geordi saying, "Dude, chill, these are your folks." It just feels like there is definitely an art and a craft and maybe a little bit of a science to writing a half-hour dramatic piece for TV, but the length can't be an excuse if something gets left out or glossed over or the pacing is just off. So I just think it's very interesting that 35 years apart, you're basically telling the same story.
I also want to bring up another Star Trek episode that maybe this is what I was thinking of more so than Family, even though Family is a fantastic, I think it's a much closer comparison. But going to the Dawn part of this story, as we see later on in Star Trek, or represented in Star Trek in some way, is this episode a DNA building block version for Spock's relationship with Sarek and Amanda? Or the way that Spock's attitude is towards Sarek when we first see him in Journey to Babel. Because I think that there is also this certain shame that Spock has of being from two worlds, the same that Don has that kind of shame of being in this spit-polished and shined and proper West Point world versus kind of like the field hand world that he's trying to shed his past from or his present from. So I think that there's a little bit of that embarrassment. And of course, you can't play it as emotionally charged as Don because Spock is Vulcan, half Vulcan, and he's struggling with that too. So, but we're seeing kind of like the dichotomy of struggling between two worlds and how the parents are factoring in there. Now, of course, Amanda and Sarek are on the flip side. They're on the white-collar side as opposed to the blue-collar side. So it adds a little bit different of a dynamic. But at the same time, though, the embarrassment is still there. The standoffishness and the distance is still there. And there's the mother figure that's trying to bridge the emotional connection between the two estranged father and son. But also, I think we also see, at least where the TAC officer is concerned, where Spock is in terms of his emotional distancing and inability to see different lifestyles and different ways people work in the Galileo 7. That's where I think when the TAC officer says you have to be able to lead so many different people that are used to teacups and plows, people that have worked the fields and are also, like professionals. These people answer to you. And if you don't know how to speak to them in every particular way, if there are 100 different languages to speak to 100 different people, you speak 100 different languages. So that's what Spock's his misgivings, his shortcomings in the Galileo 7. He didn't know how to lead just 6 other people, right? And I found that very similar to the advice that Don was getting from the TAC officer.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I hadn't even thought of comparing it to the Galileo 7 because, yeah, you're right. It's just 6 other people, 2 of whom work with him very closely. And he can't even build a consensus between him and McCoy, which part of that is, no surprise there. That's the format of the show and the characters.
I mean, one of the things that I think that we've brought up from time to time is after watching, this is the 10th now of Gene Roddenberry's scripts that we've reviewed, there has been a really interesting through line from every script. And I think that it has to do with the cadets in West Point being represented by the haves and have-nots almost in the same episode. I want to go all the way back to the Command because I think the Command is one of the episodes where both of you and I really just kind of like took interest in certain scenes. And one of the scenes, it was when Leo Tanner was invited over by John Bellman and to have dinner with the Colonel. And Leo, is talking about the small town that he comes from. And he tells the Colonel it's just a wide spot on the road. You and I both were like, wow, that is a wonderful, economically written line of basically just saying that he is from the middle of nowhere. And you can see Leo being very similar to Don in that respect, because that's where Don is coming from. But also what I love about that scene is when the colonel says, a lot of who we recruit from West Point come from towns smaller than yours. I did. So we're seeing this wonderful kind of tradition, this passing of the torch from not just kind of like the white collar, like the Hamiltons of the world, or the towns of the world. You're getting to see West Point recruiting their officer candidates from everywhere. And I found that it's just incredibly relatable, not just for a certain section of people, but for all possible candidates. And then drilling down to, once you learn this, then we have to teach you how to do this to relate to all these other people. Because the white collars don't necessarily relate to the blue collars, as much as the blue collars probably don't necessarily relate to the white collars. The thing is that all the color structure, I should say all the collar structure, is gone when rank is involved.
Yeah.
Because now you're all wearing the same color, right?
Yeah, you're probably all wearing khakis or something. So it shouldn't matter. And yet, there's a phrase that you have said in the past off mic that strikes me as also being relevant to this part of the conversation, which is that life is just an extension of high school. And so
I do stand by that.
Yeah, and kind of the leadership training that all of these cadets are going through is at least an attempt to wash that away. And good for them. Good for them. All right, Norm, as we do every week on Gene-ology and every week in the whole Mission Log podcast ecosystem, we look for the morals, the messages, and the meanings built into each episode. If in fact they're present. They're not always present, but I think they're definitely present here. Now, from a technical and writing standpoint, there is definitely more trouble here than there is duty or honor. I still wish we had seen whatever reconciliation happened between Don and Mr. Carter, but I also, as you brought to light in our previous discussion, that was not something we were going to be allowed to see in this time in, sort of American culture with this, almost deeply ingrained stiff upper lip, men don't show your feelings to anyone for any reason. So, and, I also know there's a time limit on the show, so you can't show everything. But this episode hammers home the point that you need to make peace with your past and your upbringing. I think that's really what the message that shines through, despite the structural difficulties, may be. But the show, it just seems like a bit of a cheat that it offers no pointers on how to have that conversation. But, yeah, I'm going to have to let go the fact that we don't have any idea what Don Carter says to mend fences with his father. We just spend the back half of the story saying, Don, you're a bad person and you should feel bad. And if you're not going to try to offer any advice on how to have that conversation, I almost feel like don't build the whole show about that conversation happening off screen. But I also, the other thought that occurred, that conversation is going to be different for everyone. Every father and every son. Every parent and every child. So that part of this episode, I know we don't normally do Does It Hold Up in Gene-ology? That part of the episode still, it's shaky. It doesn't completely hold up for me. The only thing that helps it overcome the fact is that the theme is universally relatable, whether it's in a military context or not.
Can I ask you a question, though, about that, Earl? I'm just wondering if you might want to consider that conversation that you wanted didn't happen between father and son but it may have happened between TAC officer and 3 friends as different prismatic interpretations of the advice he was seeking.
Oh, are you saying we've got a bit of ethos, pathos, and logos happening in the barracks?
It's possible. It's possible. I mean, this is part of Gene's like burgeoning style of writing, but there was the TAC officer. That was one way of him trying to explain in the West Point way of how Don should approach maybe not being as hard on his parents and trying to see things from different points of view without directly saying you should reconcile with your parents. And then you had Jerry run into him in the staircase and say, hey, look, if you want to live your life without a heart, that's your business. But, in my estimation, your stock fell a great deal. And then later on in their dorm room, Jerry asks Don, what's eating at you? And it's like, do you ever write your parents? Because I don't know how to. So there was that. And then there's the friend of his that came, afterwards who took Don's place at the dinner with, someone else's highfalutin parents, white-collar parents, and he was telling him about his background and how his brothers and he plowed the field. But then his brother became a doctor. His other brother became a lawyer, and he's at West Point. So there is that. Not directly, but maybe in a way that Don understands. And maybe in a way that other young men understand. Because you said that the TAC officer, we usually pay attention to him because he's in uniform, because he has rank, right? Because he's a peer, and so are his friends. So is that the way that we're supposed to get through to these young men? I'm just, I'm throwing that out there as the possibility of Gene maybe subverting something that should be a little bit more obvious for us.
And so we can infer from those conversations what the conversation was.
Perhaps. I'm offering that up as the possibility, since, you've been talking about we could have streamlined X and we could have inserted Y, but working with what we have, that's the way that I saw it possibly working out.
Right. And it's possible that my expectations for this are kind of tied up in some personal baggage that even though we didn't get to hear the conversation, all signs point to it happening. That is important because we all grow in directions that our families didn't expect or weren't prepared for. Some of us more than others. Some of us grow apart from friends. Some of us have marriages that grow apart. I'm very familiar with that situation. But despite that, reconciliation of some kind, even if it is just an agreement to politely disagree, is important because closure is a thing that is often necessary for your mental well-being. Some things can't be forgiven, and I am totally on board with that. There has been a trend in recent years about not forcing children to show overt affection for family members they just don't connect with, and I'm very much on board with that kind of thinking. But the trick is deciding for yourself where to draw the line and learning to live with where you have drawn that line. And, it turns out Cadet Carter needed to move the line, having drawn it. This stuff hits me in the feels because Don Carter does something, even if it happens off-screen, that I didn't do. I did not have a great relationship with my dad. There was a lot of bad blood between us. It's a very long story. And as an adult, I have enough distance now to say we were both responsible for it. I still remember the day my dad passed away. I was at work because that was one thing I had picked up from him at a young age. Stick with the job until the job's done. Except in the half hour between newscasts, I got a call that my father had died. Just an hour away from me. I could have been there. Someone else could have been running the tapes for the evening news. But in my mind, I had my own family to support. I felt I had to be there. I had to stick with the job until the job was done. So while Don Carter's conversation with Mr. Carter happened off-screen, my conversation with my dad never happened at all, and it never will. I could have and should have been better than that. And so, does this episode speak to me? Oh, hell yes. I would give just about anything to have that last conversation now, So, for those of you in the back, be like Don Carter, don't be like me.
I appreciate you sharing that with us, Earl, on the show. I think that's one of the great things about having a format like this, to be able to find these episodes that resonate with us in a very personal and significant way, because that's what, at the peak of what entertainment is supposed to do, that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to be able to connect with us, and it's supposed to be able to allow us to see things in ourselves that we didn't have a chance to see. And I thank you, for giving us that about your experience and how this episode obviously and directly affected you.
A tear or two may have been shed. I'll just put it that way.
Oh, I understand. You know what? I had that moment with The Visitor, in Deep Space Nine. I had that moment in very other different fandoms, and I think that that's, again, where fandoms I find they're most successful, is when they can make that emotional connection, especially when they educate ourselves about things that maybe we need a reminder of, or a refresher course, or maybe a microscope. And there's something in this episode also that, for me personally, I had to come to grips with when I was struggling like Don in terms of trying to find my own identity at work. So there's a scene, I think it's one of the more pivotal scenes in the episode. And again, I always keep bringing up, when the TAC officer shows up in West Point, pay attention, because this is where you get the "Hey Timmy" moment without "Hey Timmy." So Don says to his TAC officer, when confronted about the situation between Don and his parents, Don says, "Sir, a cadet likes to show his parents off. He likes to be proud of them, sir." And the TAC officer replies, after a few observations about the shortcomings of Don's attitude towards his parents, the TAC officer says, "The mission of this academy is to turn out men who can lead. That has something to do with understanding other people. As an officer, you have to work with all types. Some of your men will be used to teacups, some plows." And his advice kind of goes on and on and on to essentially teach John that a good officer has to be able to lead and understand all types. Now go back 18, 19 years ago, when I was first promoted to team manager at my old job, my attitude was, if you work as hard as I do, then we won't have any problems. Yes, incredibly myopic. And I learned very quickly about managing different personalities and genders at the same time. Very quickly. One-dimensional leadership isn't right for everyone. And when you're responsible for getting the very best from your team and from yourself, you have to do the one thing that is the most uncomfortable to yourself. You have to learn to put your own needs aside and always put the growth of your team first. And that just doesn't apply to work, but it applies to everything in life. Don can't change his folks. They have been who they are long before they ever had him as a son. Don, however, can change his attitude, because to the tax point, that is why Don is at the point. He's learned to adapt to be better at everything else in his life, from cleaning underneath his fingernails to earning the trust of his men. But like Jerry, if Don doesn't learn to care for those who are and think differently than him, then the one thing that Don will lose, much to the TAC officer's point, is the respect of his men. And that is something that indeed is unbecoming of a man of West Point.
So, not so much you see Timmy as you see Cadet Timothy.
Exactly. Remember, it's all about the formal part and then the moral part.
Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Special thanks to the Roddenberry Repertory players. Our cast this week featured Adam Pranica as Cadet Carter, Matthew Corey as Cadet number 1, Ryan Husk as Cadet number 2, and William Corey as Cadet number 3. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, the psychiatrist. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.